In the eyes of millions around the world, the name Pixar is often synonymous with quality. Pixar are responsible for the creation of some of the most iconic and critically acclaimed animated movies of all time, blah 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 blah. Right, I won't torture you guys with a history lesson on Pixar of all things. You know the story, you've all seen Toy Story, that's about as much info as you need before we get to the main subject. Scene transition. In the past few years, Pixar has, well, I wouldn't say struggled. They're still financially successful and award-winning company overall, most of the time, and are still capable of cranking out the odd hit every now and then. But to say that Pixar hasn't become somewhat divisive in recent years is puzzling. Despite many of their reviews being glowing, reactions from the general audience have often been split. And nowadays, it's not uncommon to see a Pixar film that misses the mark entirely. This is especially odd considering Pixar was left uncontested for over a decade when it came to animated films. The Best Animated Feature award at the Oscars was pretty much designated to a Give Disney and Pixar to Win award, but then suddenly more and more animated films started popping up from other studios, mainstream and underground, that while not all of them won at the Oscars, displayed far more visual and narrative creativity than the average Pixar film and would often, in the eyes of most people, surpass that year's Pixar film with flying colours. That's not to say there weren't still stellar animated movies released years prior, but there's been a growing resentment towards Pixar in recent years for playing it more safely. Choosing to stick to sequels to their iconic hits that often lack the original spark that made them so compelling. And when they do create an original movie, despite most of them being solid films on their own, they feel a lot less out there and creative compared to the films that defined Pixar's legacy. Exceptions can and should be made, especially for Coco, that movie is great, but as the industry is beginning to shift their visual styles and people are starting to tell more daring stories with their animated movies, in the wake of movies like Spider-Verse and Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, seeing Pixar stick to their mentality of playing it safe has begun to frustrate longtime fans of their movies. Today, I wanted to go over, in more detail, about the many issues that have plagued Pixar for a long time now, and why I believe they need to start shaking things up if they wish to hold the attention and admiration of modern audiences and people like me who grew up watching their movies. Some takes in this video may be pretty subjective, especially because of how many people still love Pixar and a lot of their current stuff, but I wanted to at least try and explain why me and many others feel that Pixar has lost a lot of their previously inescapable magic. This is not my excuse to hate on Pixar, I don't really have that capacity to hate in my heart anymore. This is more so coming from someone who still enjoys a majority of their recent stuff, but feels that there's a lot missing that the previous films got right. Back in their heyday, Pixar was often renowned for managing to tell deeply touching and human stories that came from unlikely places. While a lot of their films can be summed up as what if insert subject here had feelings, the stories on display using these simple ideas were what made Pixar films a beacon of creativity and passion, managing to tell emotionally complex and relatable stories about literally anything while making all of them feel distinct. Sure, Toy Story can be regarded as a story about friendship, but there is far more depth to these characters' emotions than you'd think just from that description, and it helps the themes of the story hit much harder. Pixar's classics constantly found new and creative ways to approach their deceptively simple subject matter. The Incredibles was a deconstruction of the superhero genre and all of its tropes, while using its main cast as an allegory for not being afraid of who you are. Ratatouille to many just looks like the funny rat movie, and then it just slaps you with a pretty striking allegory for art and class and how the world isn't kind to new talent and the barriers that the disadvantaged face when breaking into the arts, and that's why it's one of the best movies, well, ever. You could look into all of Pixar's classics and find that all of them, even the ones that aren't thematically complex, are masterfully told and impactful in ways unique to them. The concepts for the stories are simple, but at the end of the day, it's always the actual content that makes it work. I'm not saying this to be like Pixar doesn't make good films now, like some people are saying, yeah, keep huffing the Lightyear copium, buddy, because films such as Inside Out, Coco, and Soul prove that they can still tell rather thought-provoking stories in a sophisticated manner. The issue is that these three films are what I'd argue to be the only three films from Pixar since 2015 that are on par with their previous classics. Again, not to say these films are bad, because the only truly atrocious film they've made is Cars 2, if we're being honest. Most of these films, barring a few exceptions, are entertaining overall, but there's not a whole lot to them, and that's down to a few things. Number one, the sequel problem, which I'll cover shortly, because my god do Pixar have a reputation for providing only adequate sequels that don't have anything new to say. And two, the problem we'll discuss now, Pixar mostly playing it safe. Ever since Brave, a lot of Pixar's original movies outside the three I just mentioned have been a lot more by the numbers and predictable. Brave itself is one of the more divisive movies from Pixar, telling an uplifting story about improving communication between mothers and daughters, but not having a very strong story to back it up. And while Merida is far from a traditional Disney princess, it does feel very pedestrian of Pixar to take a stab at making their own Disney princess story, but not being very inventive past that basic idea. It's a story that's been told before. But if you want basic from Pixar, you look to The Good Dinosaur, which was released 2 years later. character. If you want a Pixar film on autopilot, this is the best you have. Everyone already knows it, but this movie is incredibly dull and doesn't really do anything new. Arlo overcoming his fears takes center stage, but it's a very cookie-cutter execution. Onward is a movie that exists, but its attitude towards death isn't as impactful as Coco, and the story itself is, again, a by-the-numbers family bonding adventure that is set in a visually distinct world full of so many unique possibilities for cool set pieces and world building, but it's never developed beyond a basic level. It's enjoyable, it has a pretty strong conclusion, but it lacks originality in anything beyond its art direction and world. Luca is a film that I actually like quite a bit. It's cute and heartwarming, but you'd be lying if you said this film was even remotely remarkable. Even the film's glowing reviews point out that Pixar was playing it safe with this one, and you only need to watch the first 20 minutes before you figure out what this film's deal is. Lightyear is a painfully generic sci-fi adventure, completely divorced from Buzz Lightyear if you just replace him with anyone. The reason I left out Turning Red is because, despite it being a divisive film that I'm also indifferent to, it was also a pretty different Pixar film that I can't say played it safe when it came to its subject matter. It's a very unique way to talk about puberty, I guess, even if the end result is mildly uncomfortable. These 5 films are indicative of Pixar's current storytelling problems, with them developing an interesting premise, world, and characters, but not having the narrative or thematic strength to back it up. And even when the themes are good, they aren't as neatly weaved into the story or explored in nearly as much detail as Pixar's older films are. Combine this with the absolute monster load of sequels that most people are pretty divided on, and you can see a pattern. Pixar is playing it mostly pretty safe, which would be fine for any other studio since they are still capable of giving us some really outstanding gems every now and then, but over the years, audiences have come to expect far more from Pixar beyond an intriguing premise, pretty visuals, and a light story. It's not as simple as saying old times was good and new times was bad, because most of these films are still solid entertainment. There's just a very big difference in polish compared to films like WALL-E, Ratatouille, and The Incredibles. Pixar's next film, Elemental, has sparked a lot of discussion about how safe Pixar have been playing it recently, choosing to make a forbidden love story between Fireboy and Watergirl in a place full of really generic looking character designs and in a world that doesn't seem to be taking the element part and doing anything really creative with it. Even the plot synopsis is making me snore. No one's saying Pixar has to constantly create masterpieces. That's a very unrealistic expectation even for a studio that was largely known for constantly creating masterpieces, but we still expect intriguing stories to be told that explore their world, characters, and themes with more depth in a small puddle. No one's really expecting to feel emotional over every Pixar film either. It just doesn't feel like Pixar has been trying as hard recently. If you want to get the full picture on this and why it frustrates me, then it's a good thing that we're about to talk about. It's rare that you find an animation studio that has as many universally praised and instantly recognizable IPs as Pixar. Obviously, there are plenty of animation studios that have recognizable and iconic IPs, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that Pixar's on a whole nother level. Their backlog includes not only some of the most well-known characters and stories in animation, but in film as a whole. And with that kind of recognition, critical praise, and box office returns comes a natural desire to make a follow-up. Sequels to successful films are a no-brainer, it's literally just free money waiting to be made. But critics and audiences alike will always have their expectations set high when it comes to storytelling, hoping for something that rivals or even surpasses the original. The reason why I'm using my time explaining to a group of people I hope are capable of grasping the metric system about why sequels are made is because Pixar used to never really make them, and when they did, they ended up being certified bangers. Films like Toy Story 2 and 3 were made during a time where Pixar sequels weren't even a thing outside of the Toy Story franchise. And the reason why these two sequels are held in such high regard compared to something like 2016's Finding Dory is because they do more than necessary to justify their existence, introducing new characters and stories while keeping the central theme of the trilogy at heart, growing up. You'll find many people, myself included, who consider the Toy Story sequels to be better than the original, which was already a fantastic film, providing plenty of entertaining sequences and expanding on the characters of the original installment, while using the new characters to enhance the themes. Sure, they may not have been entirely necessary outside of a business perspective. Do you even know how much money this was in 1995? Jesus! But they did plenty in order to justify their existence, making them not only profitable for the company, but respected by critics and audiences alike. Okay, so then they made Cars 2, and 2010s was a truly bizarre time to be a Pixar fan. While occasionally they crank out another instant classic like Inside Out and Coco, sequels to their most profitable IPs, was pretty much all the company had going for it, with the few original releases they had during this time frame being incredibly by the numbers and not as interesting as their previous films, despite being solid overall. And while critic reviews for many of these sequels are high, as many of them are indeed technical marvels and have many of their own unique strengths, audiences tended to be a lot more divided. In an era of Hollywood that was obsessed obsessed with banking on people's nostalgia, having sequels to some of Pixar's classics was something people were genuinely excited about. I remember absolutely flipping my shit when I saw the first teaser for Incredibles 2, but when we finally got these long-awaited sequels to the movies that largely made a majority of people's childhoods, mine included, there was something about their execution and overall vibe that just felt off. They are, for the most part, narratively solid and visually breathtaking films, but they didn't justify their own existence beyond making profits the same way that the first two Toy Story sequels did. Starting with the obvious, Cars 2 is a dog movie. It's one of the most narratively confused animated films I've ever seen, and it's the only film made by Pixar that received scathing reviews across the board. But it made nearly $600 million against a $200 million budget, being financially successful enough for another sequel. Cars 2 is an extreme example, as there's no other Pixar film I can actually call a total disaster, but it didn't do anything close to justifying why it exists. And the story is such a broken afterthought, it's like the film was generated by an AI for the sole purpose of making a quick buck, quite unlike any Pixar film to come before it. While Cars 2 is a special case of train wreck, it does fit the pattern that Pixar's other sequels would go down. It's not the fact that they weren't solid films, but they weren't nearly as good as the originals and lacked the kind of storytelling polish you would have gotten in the originals. Incredibles 2 is a fine film, but it lacks a lot of the dark, realistic edge and smart, biting commentary on superheroes that made The Incredibles such a beloved classic. Incredibles 2 is so out of touch with the original film, in fact, that there's an entire scene dedicated to the predictable twist villain monologuing and explaining their entire plan, something that the first film actively and triumphantly mocked throughout its entire runtime.
You sly dog! You got me monologuing! I can't believe it.
Incredibles 2 didn't have much to say that the first film hadn't already said, and it being a lot more lighthearted sort of cleansed the charm of what was universally considered to be Pixar's most mature film. Finding Dory is a fine film, but its plot is a massive retread of Finding Nemo, with the only difference being that Dory is the protagonist and her parents are also sort of involved. It says nothing that the first film hadn't already said. Cars 3 Toy Story 4 is pretty notorious for being a completely unnecessary continuation of the Toy Story franchise. Toy Story 3 is universally considered to be an emotionally devastating but beautiful and satisfying send-off for the Toy Story franchise. The ending of the film is written like an actual conclusion. The previous films had endings, but they were light-hearted fun that left the movies open if they were to ever be continued. TS3 didn't have that. It was a very somber ending that perfectly ties together the themes of the franchise in relation to growing up. TS4, while again being a fine film on its own and being absolutely stunning to look at, provides the Toy Story franchise a much more uneven conclusion, that while heartbreaking and well handled in isolation, has left many bitterly divided on whether or not it went against Woody's character, not even mentioning how flanderized and rock-bottom stupid Buzz became and how the iconic supporting cast, including Jessie, who was pretty much a mainstay protagonist since Toy Story 2, were relegated to glorified cameos. While it had plenty to say that other Pixar sequels did not, specifically in existentialism while not really exploring the topic as much as I'd hoped, it came at the cost of undoing a conclusion that people had held deep in their hearts for around a decade, and needlessly complicated the motivations and development of the characters who we believed were finally at some sort of peace. I think people exaggerate when they call TS4 a disaster, but out of all the sequels Pixar has made, this was the one that got many people to recognize the problem. Pixar's sequels don't feel like they're made with the same artistic care and passion that went into the original films, and don't do enough to justify their existence. And when they do have care and passion poured into them, it comes at the cost of undoing conclusions that people were satisfied with years ago. And this is strictly talking about sequels, not even the times where Pixar used an existing IP for other purposes, such as a prequel story like Monsters University, which despite being a pretty underrated film in my eyes, and has a pretty decent message about applying your skills in a different way towards something you love even if you're not cut out to do it normally, the entire existence of the film is invalidated by the fact that Monsters Inc. established Sully and Mike as lifelong friends, only for that to be retconned with them meeting in university, pretty much ignoring the original film to give it an excuse to exist. Then there's other uses of their IP, like their most recent film, Lightyear, a film that is supposed to also be the film in the Toy Story universe that inspired the Buzz Lightyear toys, basically being an origin story, except not, as the film is entirely fictional within the Toy Story universe and is basically supposed to be Andy's Star Wars. And the film that gets him hooked on Buzz Lightyear, you know, a completely normal and not complicated premise for a film at all. And that's on top of the film being a pure sci-fi adventure completely disconnected from anything Pixar have ever made, and being all the more bland and forgettable for it. This movie could have been titled anything as an original Pixar IP, but they chose to make it about Buzz Lightyear for profit. But not only did everyone on the planet give the film a resounding meh, it was also Pixar's first ever box office bomb. It shows their reliance on their existing IP, in order to help sell a film that otherwise wouldn't have interested anyone. And this constant reliance on existing movies is not showing any sign of stopping, with Toy Story 5 currently being in production, so they're undoing the ending again and doing a very poor job of getting people excited for it this time. We're also getting a sequel to Inside Out, a film that by all accounts does have plenty of potential for a sequel considering it's literally about emotions, but given Pixar's track record, I'm not feeling too confident. The majority of these movies are fundamentally flawed. They're not all bad, hell some aren't even mediocre, but they don't justify themselves or have anything particularly stunning or insightful to say unless they're literally undoing things from previous installments. There are obviously talented people behind all of these projects, but with every new sequel or spin-off Pixar creates, they begin to feel far less like actual creative endeavors by people with a vision, instead feeling like glorified cash cows. Pixar have always been at the cutting edge of computer animation. They're the whole reason why 3D animation took off in the first place and retroactively killed 2D animation as a whole, so, you know, thanks for that.
You give up a few things, chasing a dream.
But it's not an exaggeration to say that many of Pixar's films are visually stunning. While films like Toy Story 1 and The Incredibles have certainly aged, there's still a timeless quality to a majority of their films. Wall-E, Ratatouille, Up, etc. And many of their recent releases still look absolutely stellar, like Coco, Onward, and Soul. However, while we can all acknowledge that Pixar's animation is visually breathtaking when you look at it for the first time, I think we've reached a point where the incredibly realistic approach to their animation and art direction has grown somewhat stale. And despite it technically being cutting edge, their films are starting to feel less like animated movies taking advantage of animation as a medium, but as glorified live-action films. Lightyear specifically really looks like it wants to be a live-action, big-budget sci-fi flick, and honestly, I thought it made the movie look incredibly boring. Same goes for films like The Good Dinosaur, where I swear some scenes look eerily close to the live-action footage. Brave, the human scenes in Inside Out, every scene out of water and Finding Dory, pretty much all of Soul looks scarily similar to live-action. It's a technical marvel at first, but after a while it just becomes an aesthetic. Pixar is the company that makes incredibly realistic looking animations, and then almost destroys their art direction with cartoonishly proportioned humans. They could get away with this previously because we hadn't reached the point where technology could render anything this realistic, but now it ends up being a pretty uninteresting aesthetic that looks impressive for one movie despite the character designs clashing violently, but gets visually tiresome after a while because you're just watching a live action movie at this point. Again, yeah, impressive you can do that with animation, but is this even a cartoon at this point? Pixar's current visual style is one adopted by many other animation studios. Disney has the same problem, especially with the painfully forgettable Strange World that I guarantee you only remembered existed 2 seconds after I mentioned it. Illumination are pretty much the masters of creating visually acceptable looking movies with freakish looking character designs clashing with the aesthetic, something they only changed up for the Mario movie because Miyamoto was holding Chris Meledandri's family hostage. You get the picture. In all fairness to Pixar, they have tried switching up their art direction pretty drastically with a few of their recent films like Turning Red and Luca. And you know, I like Luca. I think it's a cute, if unremarkable film, and I'm honestly completely indifferent to Turning Red, and I appreciate that these films aren't as focused on making everything look so hyper-realistic. Luca borders on that and points with the environments, but to be honest, that's it. But Pixar's main visual style remains unchanged given Lightyear released after both of them. Pixar's next film, Elemental, is certainly a bit of a visual shake-up, but it's not very visually appealing or out there. The 2D concept art looks fine, but in 3D these designs just don't look right. It looks like one of those RTX Zelda CGI animations you'd find on YouTube. I can always appreciate the insane amount of time and resources that go into making an animated movie look like this, but it's become stale. And I think if Pixar doesn't shake things up, they may actually fall behind their competitors. Into the Spider-Verse needs no introduction. On top of it being one of the best films I've ever watched, personally, the impact this movie has had on the animation industry has been wild to witness. Spider-Verse felt like the first animated movie in an insanely long time that pushed the boundaries of the medium to its absolute limits. The visual style and experimentation, the blending of 2D and 3D animation to produce such a breathtaking and unique aesthetic, emphasizing the importance of smear frames, varied frame rates, and various other aspects of 2D animation in order to pack every action sequence with impactful and satisfying movement. You guys know this already. Spider-Verse is an animation masterclass, going against all the trends of mainstream animated movies with its own distinct style, and people loved it. I loved it, and that's why over the last few years we've seen its impact rock the animation industry to its core, allowing more animated properties, TV and film, indie and mainstream, to adopt a more experimental fundamental visual identity and owning it in ways that make it distinct from Spider-Verse, creating a barrage of timeless aesthetics that will age better visually than any of the ultra-realistic textures and clashing character designs of before. Arcane is one of the best looking TV shows I've ever watched, telling such an incredible story with its own blend of 2D and 3D animation. The Mitchells vs. the Machines, while being made by people who worked on Spider-Verse, still manages to stand on its own 2 feet with a blend of hand-drawn animation styles and CGI that make it an absolute joy to look at. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, a film that does not need an introduction at this point, abandoned the realistic look of the Shrek movies and the original Puss in Boots and took on a vivid, colourful and painterly aesthetic that emphasized more exaggerated expressions and movements in order to make the characters feel even more alive, while lowering the frame rate of the action scenes to make everything snappier. No joke, the final act of The Last Wish rivals the last 10 years of Pixar films easily, and with Spider-Verse itself getting a sequel later this year that's looking to get even crazier of the art direction and animation, it's safe to say we're living in a post-Spider-Verse era. There's probably a much better name for that somewhere. And frankly, Pixar's style is starting to feel dated. As much as it hurts to say, the industry is beginning to shake up its visual approach, and Pixar are going to fall behind if they keep committing to the same aesthetic that people are tired of looking at. There's nothing inherently wrong with their visuals, and no one's saying this style has to be abandoned entirely, but more variety would be really appreciated. Maybe blending the realistic stuff with other art styles, I don't know. This is not a way for me to disrespect the effort that goes into Pixar films, but I think it's time for something to change visually. Pixar will remain successful for a while, and I guarantee you that we are still going to get the odd masterpiece from them, and even a few films that don't quite reach that level but are still developed far beyond a basic concept and a few scattershot emotional beats. But we can also expect a lot of films that aren't that. More sequels of most likely questionable quality and a reason to exist in the first place. Interesting original IPs that aren't fully explored, and we're probably still going to be seeing the tried and true art direction and aesthetic that Pixar is known for. I don't think Pixar is ever going to make a film as disastrously bad as Cars 2 ever again, but I doubt we're ever going to get the consistency of old Pixar back. This video isn't an excuse to hate on Pixar because I'm not a fucking maniac. They have produced several of my favorite films of all time. I just think as someone with a deep love for the stories they tell that they can and should do better. Their current films are mostly solid, but they lack that Pixar spark. And while some of them do have that classic feeling, most of their films missed the mark of undercooked ideas, uninventive storytelling, and a lack of any real bite that made their films a treat to watch for all ages. I don't have a capacity for strong hate in my heart anymore, to be perfectly honest. I just want Pixar to keep succeeding and bringing out the full potential of their ideas, instead of just chasing the bag when it comes to sequels and fumbling it when it comes to new ideas. If you still enjoy current Pixar films, that's fine. I do too to an extent, but something needs to change.